It's like a digital game of whack-a-mole sometimes, isn't it? You block one cyber threat and another one pops up. Malware is constantly changing, morphing into new forms, finding new ways to slip past our defenses.
You're absolutely right. The digital world is this constantly shifting landscape. For cybersecurity professionals, for researchers, it feels like as soon as we build a stronger wall, the attackers are already working on a new way to climb over it or tunnel under it. And today, we're going to dig into one particular threat that's been causing quite a stir, despite not being brand new. It's called Latrodectus.
Latrodectus. Okay, that name already sounds a bit ominous. And has this other nickname, right? BlackWidow. Now, in the world of malware, there's always this focus on the latest, the most recently discovered threats. But Latrodectus, first spotted back in October 2023, is proof that older malware can still be a major problem.
It's not just about being the newest kid on the block. It's about effectiveness and adaptability. And Latrodectus definitely has both. It's technically quite sophisticated. And what makes it particularly concerning is how it's become this integral part of the broader cybercriminal ecosystem. It plays a very specific role, and it plays it well.
All right, so let's unpack this. What exactly does Latrodectus, this Black Widow, do? What's its function in the grand scheme of cyber attacks?
Think of it as a kind of advanced team. Latrodectus is what we call a malware loader. It's not designed to cause immediate damage itself. Its primary purpose is to get that initial foothold into a system. Once it's in, it sets the stage for other, often much more malicious software to be downloaded and executed. It's all about preparing the ground for the main attack.
So if we imagine other malware as the burglars who break in and steal data or encrypt files, Latrodectus is the one who picks the lock and props open the door.
That's a great analogy. It provides that crucial initial access.
And you said earlier that it's still very relevant, even though it's not brand new. What makes this particular lockpick, so to speak, so effective? What's its secret sauce?
It comes down to two key things. Firstly, it's very good at hiding. It uses a variety of techniques to evade detection by security software to stay under the radar. And secondly, and this is perhaps even more important, it's used by a number of different cybercriminal groups. Each of these groups might have their own objectives, their own targets, but they've all found Latrodectus to be a valuable tool. This widespread use across the cybercriminal world is a big part of what keeps it relevant and dangerous.
So we've got a bit of a two-pronged investigation here. We need to understand the technical side, the nuts and bolts of how Latrodectus actually works. But we also need to understand its role in this bigger picture of cybercrime. Who's using it, and what does that tell us about how these threat actors operate, how they collaborate?
Exactly. We need to look at both the how and the why to really grasp the significance of Latrodectus in today's threat landscape.
Okay, so let's start with the tech specs. Latrodectus, our Black Widow, first appeared in October 2023. And the prevailing theory is that the group behind it is Lunar Spider, the same group that developed IcedID. Now, that name should be familiar to anyone who follows cybersecurity.
Lunar Spider is a group that's definitely on the radar of security researchers and law enforcement. They have a reputation for developing sophisticated malware, and their focus is very much on financial gain. So the fact that they are the likely developers of both IcedID, which is a well-established banking trojan, and now Latrodectus paints a clear picture, they have the skills and the motivation to create tools that can lead to serious financial damage. And it's worth noting that Latrodectus primarily targets Windows systems.
Makes sense. Windows is still the dominant operating system, especially in business environments. It's where the valuable data is.
It's a target-rich environment for cybercriminals.
So how does Latrodectus typically get onto a system? What are the most common ways it spreads? How does it weave its web, so to speak?
The primary methods rely on what we call social engineering. It's about manipulating people, tricking them into taking an action that leads to the malware being installed on their system. And phishing campaigns are a big part of that. And we're not talking about the simple phishing emails of the past. These campaigns are getting increasingly sophisticated. Things like reply chain attacks, where they hijack an existing email conversation, or fake online forms, notices about copyright infringement, anything that might entice someone to click a malicious link or open a dangerous attachment.
So still relying on human error, but with much more sophisticated tactics.
Human error is always going to be a factor in cybersecurity, unfortunately. Attackers know that, and they exploit it.
Now, I remember reading about a rather unusual distribution method involving Facebook. That seemed a bit out of the ordinary.
That was a very interesting case study that was documented by Microsoft Threat Intelligence. They tracked a campaign by a group known as Storm 0249, and this campaign was distributing Latrodectus through fake download sites on Facebook.
Facebook. Wow, that's not where I'd expect to encounter malware.
It's a sign of the times. Attackers are realizing that people might have their guard down more on social media platforms. And in this particular case, they were using fake sites that were designed to look like legitimate download pages for Windows 11 Pro.
So someone's browsing Facebook, sees this link for a free Windows 11 Pro download. Sounds too good to be true, right?
It was definitely a lure designed to exploit people's desire for free software. And what made it even more interesting is this was a deviation from Storm 0249's typical tactics. They usually rely on more traditional phishing emails. So this shift to using Facebook was notable.
So what happened if someone clicked on one of these malicious Facebook links? I imagine it wasn't a direct download of Latrodectus.
It was a multi-stage infection process, very cleverly designed. Clicking the link would take the user through a series of redirects, bouncing them from one website to another. This is partly done to make it harder to track the origin of the attack and partly to evade security measures that might block known malicious sites. Eventually, the user would land on a page that looked very convincing, like a genuine software download site with a big Download Now button.
And that's the trap.
Exactly. Clicking that button wouldn't download Windows 11 Pro. Instead, it would initiate the download of a small JavaScript file.
JavaScript. Isn't that a language used for making websites interactive? What's malicious about that?
JavaScript itself isn't inherently malicious. It's a powerful language that can be used for both good and bad purposes. And in this case, the attackers were using it to download a Windows installer package, an MSI file. This MSI file contained a malicious component that was linked to a tool called BlackRotel.
BlackRotel. Now, isn't that a tool that cybersecurity professionals use for penetration testing?
You're right. It's often used for ethical hacking, for red teaming exercises, to test an organization's defenses. But like many tools, it can be used for malicious purposes as well.
So the attackers flipped the script and used a security tool against us. That's quite devious.
It's a common tactic. Attackers often adopt tools and techniques that were originally designed for legitimate security purposes.
So we've got this JavaScript file downloading an MSI package, which contains BlackRotel. Where does Latrodectus fit into all of this?
BlackRotel, in this scenario, acted as the attacker's command and control mechanism. Once it was running on the victim's machine, it would connect back to the attacker's servers. And the final step in this elaborate infection chain was for BlackRotel to download and install Latrodectus.
Wow, so it's a journey. A fake Facebook link, multiple redirects, a JavaScript download, an MSI package with BlackRotel, and finally Latrodectus arrives on the scene. Talk about a convoluted path. It really highlights the lengths these attackers are willing to go to.
And it highlights their adaptability. They're constantly looking for new ways to reach their targets, to exploit vulnerabilities, to stay ahead of security measures. In this case, using Facebook as an attack vector is a good example of that.
Okay, so Latrodectus finally manages to land on a system. What happens next? What does it do?
Its primary function is to deliver its payload. And in the case of Latrodectus, the payloads are typically other types of malware that can cause more direct damage.
And what kind of malware are we talking about here? What's Latrodectus carrying in its suitcase, so to speak?
Most commonly observed payloads are other financially motivated malware. IcedID, that banking trojan we mentioned earlier, is a frequent companion. We also see things like Luma stealers, which are designed to steal sensitive information like usernames, passwords, credit card details, and Danabot, which is another banking trojan.
So the goal here is financial gain, stealing money from individuals or organizations.
Financial gain is a primary motivator for a lot of cybercrime. It's a lucrative business, unfortunately.
And has Latrodectus ever been linked to ransomware?
It's less common, but there have been instances where Latrodectus has been used to deploy ransomware. So it can be a stepping stone to a ransomware attack, which can have even more devastating consequences.
All right, so we've established that Latrodectus can deliver some seriously bad stuff. Now, one of the key reasons it remains a threat is its ability to evade detection, to stay hidden. How does it do that? What are some of the tricks it uses to fool security software?
This is where the technical sophistication of Latrodectus really comes into play. It uses a multi-layered approach to evasion. One of the techniques it employs is what we call sandbox evasion.
Sandbox evasion. Okay, break that down for me.
A sandbox is a controlled environment that security researchers use to analyze suspicious files. It's like a virtual machine where they can run the file and see what it does without risking infection of their own systems. And malware like Latrodectus tries to detect if it's running in a sandbox,
Yeah.
and if it thinks it is, it might change its behavior to avoid it being analyzed.
So it's like the malware saying, hang on a second, something's not right here. I'm not in a real computer.
Exactly. It's trying to figure out if it's being watched.
Mm.
And one of the ways it does this is by performing various checks. For example, it might check the version of Windows that it's running on. It might check the AC address of the network adapter. It might even look for specific processes that are typically running on a real user's computer. If it doesn't see what it expects, it might suspect that it's in a sandbox.
That's pretty clever. So it's trying to blend in to make itself look like it's running in a normal environment.
And if it thinks it's in a sandbox, it might disable some of its malicious functionality or try to delay its actions to make analysis more difficult.
Okay, so let's say it gets past those initial sandbox checks. What other tricks does it have up its sleeve?
It uses techniques like obfuscation and encryption to further hinder analysis. Obfuscation is about making the code harder to understand. Encryption is about scrambling the code to make it unreadable without the decryption key. One of the methods it uses is called dynamic API resolution.
Dynamic API resolution. I'm not familiar with that one.
So APIs, or application programming interfaces,
Mm-hmm.
are essentially the building blocks of how software interacts with the operating system. Most programs use APIs to perform various actions, and traditionally when you analyze a program, you can see which APIs it's calling. But Latrodectus makes this difficult by using dynamic API resolution. Instead of directly stating which APIs it needs, it stores this information in an obfuscated way. It might use things like checksums or hashes, which are like unique fingerprints, to represent the APIs. And only when the malware is running does it calculate these fingerprints and resolve them to the actual API names.
So it's like it's hiding the ingredients of its recipe until it's actually cooking?
Exactly. This makes it much harder for security researchers to understand what the malware is doing just by looking at the code. They need to actually run it to see how it behaves, which can be risky.
And what about encryption? How does Latrodectus use that to stay hidden?
One of the key things it does is encrypt its communication with its command and control servers. These servers are controlled by the attackers, and they provide instructions to the malware and receive data that's been stolen from the infected system. By encrypting this communication, Latrodectus makes it much harder for network security tools to detect and analyze this traffic. They can see the data is being sent and received, but they can't easily understand what that data is.
It's like sending a secret message in code.
Exactly. And the encryption method it typically uses is RC4, which is a relatively simple but effective encryption algorithm.
Okay, so it's evading sandbox analysis, it's obfuscating its code, it's encrypting its communications. Are there any other stealth tactics it uses?
Another important one is the use of what we call living off the land techniques, or LOTL.
Living off the land. That sounds more like a survival skill than a malware tactic.
It's a way for the malware to blend in, to use legitimate tools that are already present on the system to carry out its malicious activities. The idea is to avoid raising suspicion by using tools that security software might not flag as malicious.
So instead of bringing its own tools, it's using what it finds in the victim's shed, so to speak.
Exactly. And in the case of Latrodectus, it often uses legitimate Windows processes, things like wscript.exe or rundle32.exe, to execute malicious code. These processes are normally used for running scripts or loading libraries, but Latrodectus can hijack them and use them for its own purposes.
That's a clever way to hide in plain sight. What about the structure of Latrodectus itself? How is it packaged? How is it protected?
It often uses packing techniques to compress and obfuscate its code. This makes the file smaller, which can help with distribution, and it makes it harder to analyze because the code is essentially scrambled. Additionally, it often encrypts strings within the malware. These strings might contain things like the addresses of its command and control servers or the names of its internal functions. By encrypting them, it makes it even harder to understand what the malware is doing just by looking at the code.
So it's like a puzzle box with multiple layers of protection.
Exactly. It's designed to make analysis as difficult and time-consuming as possible, to slow down security researchers and give the attackers more time to operate.
And I imagine that maintaining a connection back to its command and control server is essential for Latrodectus to receive instructions and download additional malware.
Absolutely. That connection is its lifeline. And it uses various techniques to ensure that communication stays active. One important method is domain rotation. It might have a list of different command and control domains, and it periodically switches between them. This makes it harder to block its communication because if one domain gets blacklisted, it can simply switch to another one.
So it's like having multiple burner phones.
Exactly. It makes it harder to track and disrupt its communications.
Now, to ensure that it survives a system reboot, what does Latrodectus do for persistence? How does it make sure it comes back even if the computer is restarted?
It uses a couple of common techniques to establish persistence. It might create scheduled tasks within Windows. These tasks are designed to run automatically at certain times or intervals, and Latrodectus can add itself to this schedule to ensure that it gets relaunched. It might also modify the auto-run registry keys. These are locations in the Windows registry that dictate which programs should be launched automatically when the system starts up. By adding itself to these keys, Latrodectus can ensure that it gets loaded into memory every time the computer boots up.
So it's really digging its claws in, making sure it's not easily removed. Now, I know that Microsoft has identified different versions of Latrodectus. Does this suggest that the malware is being actively developed and updated?
Yes, definitely. They've analyzed several versions, including versions 1.3, 1.4, 1.7, and 1.8, all released within the past year or so. Each new version tends to include refinements to its evasion techniques, perhaps changes to its communication methods, or even new functionality. This ongoing development shows that the creators of Latrodectus are actively working to improve its effectiveness, to adapt to changes in security software, and to stay ahead of the curve.
It's an arms race. And speaking of new versions, what about the latest one, version 1.9? What's new in that version?
Version 1.9, which was first observed in February of this year, 2025, is a good example of how Latrodectus continues to evolve. This version reintroduced the use of scheduled tasks for persistence. Perhaps they had experimented with other methods in previous versions that proved less reliable, so they've gone back to a tried and tested technique. But importantly, version 1.9 also added a new command, which we refer to as command 23. This command allows the malware to execute arbitrary Windows commands via the standard Windows command line interpreter, cmd.exe.
So it can basically run any command that the attackers want on the infected system.
Exactly. It gives them a lot of flexibility in terms of what they could do. They can use it to download additional files, to modify system settings, to steal data, to basically do whatever they want.
That's a worrying development. It seems like Latrodectus is becoming even more powerful and versatile. Okay, we've gone pretty deep into the technical details. Now let's shift gears and talk about who's actually using this malware in the wild. You mentioned earlier this idea of a collaborative cybercrime ecosystem. Who are the main players associated with Latrodectus?
We've already mentioned Lunar Spider, the group that's believed to be behind the development of Latrodectus. They're a financially motivated group, highly skilled, and they often act as what we call an initial access broker. This means that they develop tools like Latrodectus, and then they sell or lease access to compromised systems to other criminal groups. These other groups might specialize in things like ransomware deployment or data theft.
So Lunar Spider is like the arms dealer in this scenario. They create the weapons and then other criminals use them to carry out the attacks.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
And one of the groups that's been observed using Latrodectus is TA577.
TA577. I've heard that name before.
They're a very active initial access broker. They specialize in launching large-scale phishing campaigns, primarily targeting organizations in North America and Europe. They've been around since at least mid-2020, and they have a reputation for being prolific and adaptable. They were early adopters of Latrodectus, started to use it in their operations in late 2023. And their typical business model is to gain initial access to a network, and then they sell that access to ransomware affiliates who then carry out the actual ransomware attack.
So they're like the scouts, finding the targets and opening the door for the main force to come in.
Exactly. And they've been very successful at it.
And are there any other notable groups that use Latrodectus?
Another one that's worth mentioning is TA578. They're also a financially motivated group, and they're heavily involved in mal spam campaigns and the deployment of malware loaders. What's interesting about TA578 is that, at least as of early 2024, they seem to be using Latrodectus almost exclusively in their email-based attacks. Their goal, like TA577, is to gain initial access, which they then monetize through ransomware deployment or data theft.
So both TA577 and TA578 are using Latrodectus as this crucial first step in their attacks. And we also talked about Storm0249 earlier, the group that was using Facebook to distribute Latrodectus. Do they fit into this picture of initial access brokers?
Storm0249's tactics are a bit more unusual, and it's not entirely clear what their ultimate goals are. But the fact that they went to the trouble of setting up those fake download sites on Facebook and using that multi-stage infection process involving brood ratel suggests that they see value in using Latrodectus, that it meets their needs in some way.
And then there's the link to ALPHV BlackCat, the ransomware group.
That connection goes back to Lunar Spider, the developers of Latrodectus. There's evidence to suggest that Lunar Spider has some kind of collaborative relationship with ALPHV BlackCat. It's possible that Lunar Spider's malware, including Latrodectus, is used to gain the initial access that ALPHV BlackCat then exploits to deploy their ransomware.
So Latrodectus is potentially playing a role in some very high-profile ransomware attacks.
It's certainly possible, and ALPHV BlackCat is a major player in the ransomware world. They're a very sophisticated ransomware-as-a-service group. They use a variety of extortion tactics, and they've been linked to some very damaging attacks, including the attack on MGM resorts back in 2023.
That attack was a major wake-up call for a lot of organizations, and the fact that there's this potential connection between Latrodectus and ALPHV BlackCat is a real cause for concern. So it seems like Latrodectus has developed quite a reputation in the cybercriminal underground. What is it about this malware that makes it so popular among these different groups?
A few things contribute to its reputation. First of all, its evasion capabilities are excellent. It's proven to be very effective at getting past security software and establishing a foothold on systems. Secondly, its association with a group like Lunar Spider gives it credibility. Lunar Spider has a reputation for producing high-quality malware, so there's a sense that if it's coming from them, it's going to be good. Thirdly, its role in facilitating these high-impact attacks, especially ransomware attacks, makes it valuable. And finally, the fact that it's being actively used by multiple different groups with different objectives is a testament to its versatility and effectiveness.
So it's like a Swiss Army knife for cybercriminals. It can be used for a variety of purposes, and it does its job well. And the fact that we're seeing these new versions emerge with new features and refinements suggests that it's going to be around for a while.
Definitely. It's a constantly evolving threat. And this is a point that's really worth emphasizing. The fact that Latrodectus has been around for a couple of years now, the fact that we understand how it works, doesn't mean that it's no longer a threat. In fact, the opposite is true. The fact that it's still being used, that it's still being developed, shows that it's effective.
It's a good reminder that cybersecurity is not a one-and-done thing. It's an ongoing process. You can't just assume that because you've dealt with a particular threat in the past, it's gone forever.
Exactly. Threats evolve, tactics change, and we need to be constantly adapting our defenses to stay ahead of the curve.
So, to sum up our deep dive into Latrodectus, we've learned that it's a sophisticated, adaptable, and persistent malware loader. It's favored by a variety of cybercriminal groups because it's effective at evading detection and establishing a foothold on systems. And it's often used to deliver dangerous payloads, like banking trojans and ransomware, that can have serious consequences for victims. But perhaps the most important takeaway from all of this is the interconnectedness of the cybercriminal ecosystem. The fact that we see groups like Lunar Spider developing tools like Latrodectus, groups like TA577 and TA578 using it to gain initial access, and groups like ALPHV BlackCat potentially using it as a stepping stone to ransomware attacks shows a level of collaboration and specialization that's concerning.
It's not just about individual attackers anymore. It's about organized crime, with different groups playing different roles in the attack chain. And this makes it even more challenging to defend against these threats. It's not enough to just focus on blocking the final payload like the ransomware. We need to disrupt the entire chain, and that means preventing that initial access that tools like Latrodectus provide.
So we need to be thinking about defense in depth, about layered security, about making it as difficult as possible for these attackers to gain a foothold in the first place.
Absolutely. And we need to be aware of the evolving tactics and techniques that these attackers are using. Knowledge is power. The more we understand about how these threats work, the better equipped we are to defend against them.
Well, this deep dive into Latrodectus has certainly been eye-opening. It's given me a lot to think about, and it leaves me with this somewhat unsettling question. Given the adaptability of these attackers, given the collaborative nature of cybercrime, what new and unexpected threats might we see emerge in the future? What's the next Latrodectus? How do we prepare for something that we don't even know about yet?
That's the million-dollar question, and there's no easy answer. But I think the key is to focus on building resilient systems, on having strong security foundations, on staying informed about the evolving threat landscape, and on fostering a culture of cybersecurity awareness within organizations and among individuals.
It's about being proactive, about being prepared, about not waiting for the next attack to happen before we take action. Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks so much for sharing your expertise. This has been a fascinating and informative conversation.
And a pleasure. It's been great to discuss this with you.
And to our listeners, Stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay safe out there in the digital world.